I discovered recently that torches like this have a lens in the end. You know what else has a lens? A camera. So I'm going to make a camera lens out of the lens in a torch. Obviously, the first step is to get the lens out and preferably not drop it. If I just take this lens and whack it on there, that's odd. It hasn't worked. Obviously, it's not going to either. There's a little bit more to making a camera lens than that. Most notably, not sticking it on top of an existing camera lens. So, how does a camera lens work? This is a side-on view of a camera lens. We have our scene up the front, then we have our front element, our iris or aperture, and finally the sensor at the back. So what's going on here? Light comes in from our scene, and at this point the light rays are all going in random directions. We then have a lens which focuses them more or less to a point. But some of the light rays don't get focused to a point. For example, this one here and this one here. Those light rays are what we would call out of focus. So we use the aperture to block them. This is why, as we shrink the aperture or increase the f-stop of a camera lens, we get closer and closer to only having the light rays focused to a point. This is why your depth of field decreases. It's also why the amount of light reaching your sensor decreases. Finally, these go through the aperture and onto the sensor. But the image is upside down. And we don't have a fix for that. We simply just flip it digitally after the fact. And our camera processes the image, and that's how we get a photo. So how does autofocus work, or focus in general? It's actually quite simple. These light rays, which are out of focus per se, in the normal sense, actually just converge further back than the other ones. So in order to bring them into focus, what we want to do is move our lens forward and then bring those light rays into the aperture. At which point these ones, which are diverging at this point, will collide with the sides and get blocked out. Let's get to building. I've just made the first prototype in CAD, and it's pretty simple. It just is an f/20 lens with fixed focus and fixed aperture, and it just mounts it about the right distance from the sensor. It is going to be incredibly dark, but it's incredibly bright outside, so I have faith. Not very much, but a little. Assembling this lens is very simple. We take our lens and we place that in the back of our 3D printed enclosure. Next, we take this back plane with a teeny hole in it and put that in. And now we have a lens, but does it work? For this, I'm going to be using a Z50 because it's the smallest sensor camera I have, and this is not a large sensor lens. Anyway, let's see how it goes. It mounts on just like this, and we twist it into position. There we go. Oh my god, we have a lens! That's insane. There's pretty crazy vignetting, but that is most definitely a lens. Wow. Alright, we'll switch to my crazy good lens now. Good evening, YouTube. This is shot entirely on the torch lens. Has quite an irritatingly zoomed in field of view, but it's still pretty crazily good. Now, the biggest issue with this is distance is just not in focus at all. So I think what I'm going to do is shrink the aperture even further, and that way hopefully be able to get a bit more focus there. But also, I'm going to move the lens slightly further back. only about 0.5 millimeter with a shim.
I re-3D printed it and the assembly was pretty simple.
Now we have our completed lens, and it's got a little bit more heft to it and a much smaller aperture, but I think it'll work a little better. So let's attach it to our camera. I actually re-3D printed the outside and included a location dot so I can get it in the right position this time. Cool feature about this camera is you can just crop in on the sensor, and that's exactly what I've done. Now that does obviously give us more zoom, so our 30mm lens is now more like a 70 to 100mm lens. It's quite zoomed in, but it actually doesn't look too bad, other than the fact that I am now shooting at a ridiculously high 2500 ISO in daylight. Let's go. But let's try and take some pictures with it.
This lens has quite a unique look when you use the full APS-C sensor. However, you can crop in to a 1-inch sensor and then the vignetting goes away.
I've actually played around a little bit more with this camera now, and I think I've got it dialed in. So check out this footage. Honestly, this video worked out pretty well. I'm not gonna sit here and pretend that I have made a Carl Zeiss Zenitessa or anything like that, but I am gonna sit here and say, I think I did a pretty good job. And apart from some minor issues with this lens, like the focus and the color and the spherical aberration, and the fact that it only works on a bit smaller than a 1-inch sensor, I'd say I did a pretty good job. So there we go, 16mm camera lens. What was it actually? I think it was 10mm camera lens. 10mm camera lens mounted entirely by me.